What if somebody does this assessment and they find that maybe their anxiety is leading to a benefit, or at least what they're seeing as a benefit in their life? Maybe it's helping them, grind it out at work, or we could probably give other examples as well, but that's one that pops into my head. And they're like, yeah, I can see how these other things are a problem. I can't drive on the highway. I'm eating and this is not in a healthy way and I'm putting on extra weight. But what about the fact that my anxiety is also keeping me driven and focused and productive at work? I don't want to touch that part. Is that okay? We just kind of leave that alone? What would you say to somebody saying that to you?
I'm glad you bring that forward because I hear this a lot, especially with folks who are particularly identified with anxiety. It's almost like they've taken it on as a personality or an identity, knowingly or generally unknowingly, because who wants to take that one on as an identity? So here you can think of it as performance anxiety, or if I'm not anxious, I'm not going to meet this deadline, or whatever flavor of that. I think that's what you're talking about. This has a fascinating history, and I had to look this up as I was writing the book, where this goes all the way back to, I think it's 1908, when two researchers, their names were Yerkes and Dodson, and we know their names because this became so famous just in the last couple of years. So they were studying Japanese dancing mice, okay? And they had decided to shock these mice to variable degrees. It's kind of like, a little bit of shock, so mild, moderate, and severe shock. And they wanted to see how much this shock would affect their performance on some task, like running through a maze or something. And what they found was this kind of Goldilocks phenomenon where, mild shock wasn't enough to get them off their butts to run through the maze. Moderate shock, got them going. And severe shock was slightly less helpful at their performance than the moderate shock. So here, Goldilocks rules the day, where they can say, oh, mild arousal, a certain level of arousal helps these mice perform. Now, this paper went largely unnoticed for a long time. It was cited, I think, fewer than 10 times in the next, or even fewer than that in the next 50 years. But then this famous psychologist, Hans Selye, gave a talk. And without evidence supporting this, he suggested that maybe anxiety could be the same type of arousal and enhancing. Let me just say that again. That arousal, or that anxiety could be that arousal performance enhancing hormone or drug in our body, natural drug. So said this, one of his former graduate students went on 2 years later to do another study with rats where he held their heads underwater and as, I guess, his measure of anxiety. And he found that if he held their heads underwater too long, shock of all shocks, they didn't perform as well. I don't know if it was them just trying to catch their breath or what. But this guy wrote in his paper that he used the words arousal and anxiety interchangeably, and then called it this Yerkes-Dodson law, that this was a law that, you need a little bit of anxiety to perform well and a lot not so much. So this Yerkes-Dodson paper was cited fewer than 10 times until the year 2000. It was cited about 100 times between 2000 and 2010. And since then, it's been cited over 1,000 times. So there's been this exponential curve in people citing this original research, thinking, that, oh, it's about anxiety that improves performance. But when you look back at the literature, only 4% of papers suggest that this inverted U-shaped curve, that sweet spot for anxiety, is helpful. And over 10 times that many papers suggested that it is not true. There's a negative relationship. The more anxious you are, the worse you perform. There was a great review article written about this in the last couple of years. I forget the name of the author, but it was something like, from law to folklore. How the Yerkes-Dodson law just really blew up, probably helped by the internet. And a heuristic that makes sense to people, where they can just say, oh yeah, well, it's okay, I need a little bit of anxiety, as compared to having to face their anxiety. And what I would say is, if we could clone ourselves into the parallel experiment, try doing a task when you're anxious versus try doing a task when your brain is fully functioning. you know, which one's going to help you more? And so if people say, well, I needed to get me off the couch to do a project or get my task done, what I would say is there are better ways to motivate ourselves than freaking out, and including, I write a lot about this in my book about curiosity, like finding these intrinsically motivating attitudes that we all have that don't cause long-term health problems like anxiety does, and can actually potentially, God forbid, help us live happier, healthier lives.
I'll just pull a specific example here. When I think about, say, going up and giving a speech and the little bit of anxiety, I'm sure most people would experience in that situation, unless they're doing it, on a daily basis or something like that. And maybe it's just an association instead of causation. If we looked at, the anxiety, at least to a small degree, that the average person is going to experience in that case, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's helping, but that might just be on par for the course when you're, going up in front of a group as a person that doesn't do that regularly.
Yes, I think you're highlighting something that my PhD mentor used to say to me all the time. He said, Jud, you have to make sure that you're proving causation rather than correlation. Correlation means he described it as true, and unrelated, where you could be anxious, you could give a good speech, but it doesn't mean that the anxiety caused you to give a good speech. You really have to prove that you have to have anxiety to give a good speech. And there are plenty of people that give great speeches when they're not anxious. A lot of people take beta blockers to help them not be anxious so that they perform better in speeches when they're not used to doing that regularly. So I would guess this is the case of true, and unrelated, that is correlation, as you're pointing out, rather than causation.